What is shaking, everybody? Welcome to the Wind Up Podcast. I am your host, Mike of MTGA Wines, and it is the end of January 2025. Y'all know what that means. It is our monthly Q&A episode. Your questions, my answers. We're going to dive into as much as we can over the next 30, 40 minutes or so. I apologize for the brief hiatus last week. I was very under the weather, incredibly stuffed up and sniffling and all the things, and trying to record a show last week was less than optimal. Speaking of which, if you hear a little dead air today, that's probably because I had a sneeze roll through and I'm trying to spare your earbuds. We're still a little congested this week. Probably more information than you needed, but we're back feeling much, much better compared to last week, luckily enough, and we're ready to tackle the show today. Before we do, as usual, a few quick announcements. Be sure to continue to follow us, and if you're not following us, you definitely should be on our social networks. That's at MTGA Wines on YouTube, Instagram, The Book of Face, and the social network formerly known as Twitter. You can find us here, there, and everywhere on those platforms. You can also slide into our DMs on any one of those networks to submit questions for our monthly Q&A sessions that happen on the last Wednesday of each month. If you prefer to send us a quick note via email, you can also head to our website. That's mtgawines.com. Scroll down on the homepage a little ways. You'll see a little email form that you can fill out and send directly to me to submit your questions as well. While you're on the website there, you can also sign up for our newsletter, Wine Club, see a little bit more information on our wines, who we are, what we do, all of that good stuff. We are still brought to you by Premier Crew Clothing. That's Premier Crew, C-R-U, clothing.com. You can head over to get your wine-inspired swag and use code Premier during checkout for 20% off your first purchase. Get over there, get you some. I've got a few of those t-shirts. They're super comfy. There's a majority of them made in North America here or the USA in particular, which is great to support something a little bit more local. And they're comfy, they're nice, and they're kitschy, and they're fun. All of the good things. One final announcement for all of you on our mailing list and specifically in our wine club. We sent out our shipment notifications, so you're going to be seeing, if you're in either one of those, you're going to start seeing those notifications start coming your way tomorrow. That'll be actually the day this podcast is published. I definitely said that weird because I'm recording this on Tuesday the 28th. It'll be released on the 29th, and during those festivities of listening to the show, there's a good chance that if you're in our wine club, you're going to be hearing from me about the wines that are going to be coming your way. That is my big to-do list this week, is to get the wine club all processed and our new batch of Cabernet Franc, single barrel Merlot, and some library wines out and about. So again, more information on that if you go to our website. And if you're currently on our mailing list and not in a club, you'll be getting your release notice next week after we get through all the wine club processing to make sure they get all of that stuff first and foremost. Perks of being in the club. You know how it is. All right, let's get into it, shall we? There were a boatload of topics to kind of sort through. There's definitely not enough time in just this one episode to cover the questions that we got submitted over the course of this last month. So I picked a couple that were interrelated, one that's in particular kind of looking forward to the upcoming grape harvest, and a little bit back to kind of like the business basics of the industry and kind of what we're contending with as we get into a new year. So hopefully some interesting topics. We'll try and tackle as many of these as we can. And of course, if we don't get to all of them, I have basically a Google Doc just running of everything that we've covered on top of everything that we need to cover. So don't you worry. We will find time for your questions if we don't get to them in this episode. Now, first and foremost, we're going to dive right into kind of the business and bottling side of things with our good buddy Mike. Appreciate you for submitting these. A couple of the questions that are being featured today, actually, for today's episode. So, what is the excuse for bottling costs going up 30 to 40% other than that is what the market will bear? It's a good question. It seems excessive, like a lot of other things maybe it can be based on inflation, supply chain issues, energy costs, etc., etc. But when all those go down, the cost does not. So here's the thing. You're right, is that it seems excessive. I would agree with you. The issue is that those costs have not gone down. We have not seen negative inflation. Inflation has kind of gotten us to where we are today, and the pricing hasn't receded at all. So as a part of kind of these costs continuing to go up, and this is kind of how we had to approach it. I know other wineries and businesses in the industry did the same thing. If you're seeing, not only this inflation just kind of going through the roof, but just kind of the normal kind of cost of doing business going up at the same time. And if it's a 30 or 40% jump, we aren't able to do that, say, all in a calendar year, that we have to kind of try and spread it out. Because if I'm going to raise my prices by 40% across the board on everything that we do, that typically doesn't work out very well. So some of the costs aren't necessarily going up 30 or 40% anymore. Certain things are, like our glass supplier for a couple of the molds that we typically use in our August bottling run. Those have gone up quite a bit. We are actually in talks with a new supplier as a result, because we don't want to pay that price. And we're trying to find a way to mitigate some of these increases. There are other things that are a little bit more normal. You see the percentage increase here or there, just based on everything continuing to rise. Inflation kind of as the biggest factor, and the supply chain crisis, an even bigger factor, kind of contributing to inflation and a lack of supply and all of that good stuff. But we haven't seen it recede at all, right? So pricing really hasn't gone down. Right? Like, even though inflation has decreased, but it's still positive. So you're seeing increases in the cost of everything still. And none of these prices have receded. We've seen that with gas. We've seen that with groceries. Like, this is just the new normal that we're having to absorb over the last few years. And there are plenty of places that haven't kept up with inflation, that haven't raised their prices probably accordingly, and are in a little bit more of a bind. We're seeing that with some of our vendors. We're also seeing it through their own supply chains of the factories, they're buying their glass bottles from the barrels that are being produced. A lot of these folks are, in essence, brokers for some of these folks. They need to get their cut. They're figuring out what their margin is actually going to be. Realistically, it's, as much as it might just be what the market will bear to a certain extent, some of this is just baked into just the operating costs of every business right now. This next month, as we get into February, I'm going to be doing I'm going to take this and kind of run with it a little bit, because I want to do just a comparative kind of analysis of our costs. And I'm going to pull straight from our own financials and be like, hey, here's what we spent on glass. Here's what we spent on labels. Here are the things that are impacting our kind of bottom line, and talk about that a little bit more to see how they've kind of made these jumps. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens as we go down the road, because as we've talked about on the show, the demand for alcohol in general has dropped. People are drinking less. There are less wineries doing well in terms of overall sales. There's a glut of wine that's available. You have oversupply, under demand, and that's going to ripple through the rest of the industry. This isn't necessarily just going to affect bottling. This affects vineyard management. This affects, winery teams and staffing and all this good stuff. Actually, the vineyard management's a great thing to talk about, and I'll do like a little aside on it real fast, because people are realizing that a lot of the vineyard kind of contractors, the people that you hire for their crews and doing your vineyard work, it's so expensive now that it's almost cheaper to hire 1, 2, or 3 full-time employees and just have them do that work for you on a full-time basis, rather than bring in a big team for pruning, for disking or ripping the vineyard. The only time theoretically that you might need that influx of work is going to be in the fall around harvest. So there are a lot of kind of areas in which the wine industry is going to start to see some corrections because of the lack of sales. If the growers have to sit on a lot more fruit again this year, it's going to be really interesting to see how that affects grape prices, what they're going to be able to spend on farming as a result. And you might see prices start to actually come down. But it's going to take another year, if not 2, before we see that as the producers. And then it's going to take another, year or 2 for it to start making its way out into the world after we're done making the wine. So as with all things in the wine world, it's a long game. This is not something that's going to change. You're not going to see prices recede overnight from one vintage to the next. it's going to be a long-term process if it even happens at all. I don't believe that a lot of it is what the market will bear. There are certain things that could contribute to, because there are only so many bottling companies that do this kind of work. There are only so many farming companies that might have time to work with you. And if they corner the market, then yeah, you got to just pay up without any other options. But if people are bottling less wine, if people are, ripping out vineyards and not spending as much on their farming, then guess what? Those prices have to come down and get more competitive. It's the system at work. So we'll see. I do have some hope that things are going to start to kind of remedy themselves in this way, but I might have mentioned it's going to take at least a couple of years, if not 3, at a minimum, to start to reset pricing in any way, shape, or form. And even then, it'll be just what the market can bear to a certain point. But as long as we see the costs continuing to hover where they're at, this just kind of is what it is. That includes our vendors, that includes, what we're spending to make our wines, all that good stuff. Everything has gone up immensely because of inflation over the last 4 years. Energy costs, supply chain issues, everything that you listed. But none of those have gone down. They've either flattened out or they are continuing to creep up ever so slightly with the natural inflation that the Federal Reserve tries to keep in play, which is typically around like 2%, right? There's always kind of this positive inflation that we see, not negative inflation. And outside of a lack of demand or kind of a market correction, you don't see pricing reset. And that's kind of what we're waiting on. We're waiting to see if this correction really kind of happens, or I suppose, inflation goes negative and maybe, things start. I'm no economist. I don't know what that means for the wine industry, but it doesn't sound like it's necessarily the silver bullet to this. It sounds like you're going to have to just get through this correction, industry, specific industry kind of recession to get to the other side and then see how it shakes out. It's a little nerve-wracking. The excuse will certainly be rising costs and just this is where they're at now. As well as, you have a few players and a few segments of this industry between like farming companies and bottling lines and things that in essence have the market cornered. The growers were very much the same way when it comes to selling Napa Cabernet. It's like, if you don't buy it, someone else is going to. So you're going to have to pay this price whether you like it or not. And we're at a point now where that's not the case. At least it wasn't last year. And as we go into this new year, we'll see if that shakes out again. And if it does, things will start to correct and we'll start to see this level out in some way. Unfortunately, my crystal ball is not quite good enough to tell you exactly how, but we'll get there. At least I think so. As long as this year kind of shakes out the way I think it's going to. Alrighty then. Question number 2. Let me type in my timestamp here. I forgot to do that on the first question, so I'm going to have to listen to my own voice, which is going to be super annoying. But we'll do what we can. All right. What causes a winery to stop making a particular wine, even if club members and fans love it? How does the focus shift from there? This is from a back and forth with probably one of our original club members. Shout out to Scott. He has been a huge supporter. He might actually have every single wine I've ever made in his cellar. I'm pretty sure he does, actually, except for kind of the new stuff that's coming out this month. But we were talking, this back and forth was surrounded around our Pinot Noir because we had to axe the Pinot from our production. We haven't made any since 2021. So the last bit that we have left is just the library that we have and kind of trying to stretch that out. So we have some available for the foreseeable future and to kind of give us a cushion to try and get it back into the program sooner rather than later. But it's been 3 full years, going on 4 years, that we've been able to make it. And very typically, and this is no shade towards you all who are supporters, club members on our mailing list, all that good stuff, but very typically when a winery axes something from their program, it means it's not super financially viable, period. And that was certainly the case, and why we had to make the tough decision to stop making Pinot Noir in our lineup. The reason really was because, even though we have a lot of fans of that particular wine, it simply was the slowest mover for us. And when we needed to add Cabernet to our lineup, we had to make room for it somehow. We're spending a lot of money on Pinot Noir grapes, barrels, the whole nine, different labels that were expensive, like all the stuff. It all adds up. And if we could commandeer a little bit of those funds and invest it in our Cabernet program, then, maybe, just maybe, we can add something to our lineup that moves at a little bit of a quicker pace that more people enjoy. It's a tough decision, and I don't think any winery takes it lightly because we don't want to alienate the people that have supported us, especially when it comes to specific wines that they really, really enjoy. But sometimes the focus just has to shift. To put it into perspective as just the slowest mover in terms of sales. We've had, unfortunately, from, 2017, well, it's really 2017 until, 2022 or 3, we've never been close to, even remotely close to selling out of our normal Bennett Valley Pinot Noir. The single barrel stuff, sure, because we only make, a couple hundred bottles of it. But for the thing that, for the production of it, the bulk of it, that's, even around 100 to 150 cases, it's taken multiple years to sell through all of that. And at a certain point, we can't keep sitting and piling up all that inventory if it's not going anywhere. And despite the fact that we have a good list of people that really, really love our Pinot Noir, for example, it's just not enough people. If we had, honestly, if there were another, let's say, if there were like another 30 people on our mailing list that were buying on average 6 bottles to a case of it every year, it might be a slightly different conversation. But the numbers just don't back that up. People come to us more so for our Merlot, for our blend, and for our Cabernet. And it's just a wine that, has its niche and it finds it kind of its spot, but it just never really caught on. So that's typically why a winery will stop making a particular wine. It could also be because they had to rip out or replant that vineyard, so they're not going to make that specific wine for a few years because they need to get that vineyard back in full, fighting form. Those are a couple of kind of the main reasons. It could also be that maybe the quality just isn't there for that particular wine in that given vintage, and they might skip a vintage and move on to the next one. We've done that with a couple of wines in the past. So, there's all kinds of reasons, but the biggest one is simply you kind of hit this brick wall and you can keep banging your head against it. But, if it continues to be, a loss leader, then it's like, okay, well, we either keep just taking this one on the chin or we try and find another way to invest this money into a different part of the program and grow as a business. Because I'll tell you right now, the fact that we made that shift and started making Cabernet instead of Pinot is why we're in the state that we are in terms of being a fully fledged wine production that's been operating for a decade and a half. It's why I can actually afford to work full-time for our own company versus, still having a part-time or even a full-time job somewhere. If we had only focused on Pinot Noir and never added Cabernet or Cabernet Franc to our lineup, that just wouldn't be the case. And the numbers, the tail of the tape, tells that story. I love our Pinot, and I know a lot of other wineries love the wines that they produce, but when something's broke, you got to fix it. And sometimes that means taking it apart before you can put it back together again. So, a lot of wineries will try and add something back to the fray as the years go on. They'll try and find some time to, bring it back in some way. That way they don't leave you hanging necessarily. But it's going to take, a lot of buy-in from the folks on that mailing list or in that club or that are visiting the winery to get it back into fighting shape again. That's kind of the reality. It's not something that any winery takes lightly because they don't want to alienate consumers that might be there just for that one particular wine. But, you can't, if that one person was buying 150 cases of wine, that's a different story. If they're buying 6 bottles or a case, that doesn't necessarily warrant making 150 or 200 or 1,000 cases of it, So you have to play that game a little bit. It sucks. I don't like playing it. Because I like that wine in particular. I love making it. It's a pain in my ass, but I love it. And especially as it gets a little bit older, I love the older vintages of it. But it's a slow mover. and we needed to find a way to integrate Cabernet into our lineup. And many other wineries will do the same thing. They'll say, hey, what's not working here? Because there's maybe something else that we could do that could be more profitable and help our business rather than kind of weigh it down. So those are the main reasons. And that focus will really shift kind of based on what that winery might need or what they want to add to that particular program. Yeah. Okie dokie. Question number 3. All right. Oh, this is diving right in. This is another question from our buddy Mike. Although 100% cabs are popular, have you thought of bottling a Bordeaux blend in which you combine your expertise around Merlot and Cab with smaller amounts of Petite Verdot, Malbec, and Cab Franc? Stated otherwise, I thought ACV was brilliant in coming out with the Eloge years ago. Why not you? We do it to a certain extent because we do have our repechage, our red blend that is typically Merlot. It's been Merlot and Cabernet dominant historically because we just haven't been making Cab Franc until recently. As of 2022, we have enough Cab Franc around that we can actually use it for blending purposes. So our 2022, that's going to be coming out this fall of 2025, will have actually 18% Cab Franc in it. It's 42% Merlot, and then the balance, 40%, is going to be Cabernet Sauvignon. So we play with that. I've messed around. There was a year, I think it was 2018 maybe. I think it was 18. It was 18 or 19 where we did get a little bit of Malbec and played with that for blending purposes. But to be completely honest, Malbec is not my favorite variety. It's not that I don't like it. It just doesn't really do anything for me. So I haven't found a good way to integrate that. And Petite Verdot, I frankly just don't like. It's one of those wines that it's more for beefing up the color and the structure of a wine. You know, a good Petite Verdot on its own is really tough to do. It's not impossible. It is certainly doable, but you know, it doesn't jive really well with our style, in my opinion, because we already make pretty dry, really structured wines compared to some of our peers. And I don't want to double down on that and make things too heavy-handed, if you know what I mean. You know, whenever a winery is kind of considering adding a bottling or changing up a blend or whatever the case may be, this is the kind of stuff we think about is one, do we actually have like the ability to do it? Do we have like the volume of the certain varieties that we're working with that we can actually use it? Because let's say a blend needs, 60 gallons of Cabernet Franc, but you only have 40 available. And you're like, well, that's not going to work. So we need to mess with the numbers here and find a different blend that's going to work. Or we need to just decrease the production of that overall so that it makes sense. The other side of it too is just access, trying to find, Petite Verdot or Malbec in like a really small quantity. We're talking like a half of a ton. No one's going to sell me that. I would have to go out most likely and buy that wine kind of pre-made on the bulk market and then hope that it jives with what I got going on in the cellar, and that it becomes more of a blending component. And frankly, I don't want to do that. Trying to track down those smaller amounts, you're typically going to have to buy at least a ton or 2 or 3. And we don't have any other place for those varieties in our portfolio right now. We just don't. So, when you're thinking of adding something on or trying to be creative and bring stuff in on a more regular basis, that's kind of the stuff you have to consider, is that it's not just that small amount that you need for that blend in particular, but if you have excess, because you're probably going to have to buy more than you need, where does that go? What do you do with that? And that's, do you create another wine and kind of another blend of some sort? We already make, I think, a lot of wines, maybe one too many in my humble opinion, where I think we might have gotten out, like for us in particular, gotten out over our skis just a little bit in that sense. So, I want, like right now we're kind of in this refocusing effort of saying, let's do Merlot and, let's focus on Merlot. Cab, we've got that little bit of Pinot Noir I mentioned kind of left in our library. We'll have our Cabernet Franc and our red blend and really focus on kind of 5 distinct wines and then maybe some reserve bottlings thereof, like the single barrel Merlot, the single barrel Cab Franc, our Grand Cask, and kind of create other stuff within those programs, but they kind of stick to their own silos rather than adding on more and more and more and more. So we're really trying to kind of simplify things right now. We'll see though. If we continue to grow and we see good traction with our red blend, and it continues to be kind of a something that we need to grow in production for our club and for the demand that we're seeing, then yeah, sure, maybe we add on some of this stuff. But right now at our current production level, bringing in anything else right now, especially with kind of the rocky position the alcohol industry is in, is a little bit irresponsible. So we're, kind of slow playing a lot of this stuff right now. It's always stuff that we've thought about. It's kind of on the back burner for the time being, but we'll see. We'll see it happens. And a lot of producers are doing that right now. They're kind of waiting to see how this whole grape report, comes out and what things are looking like pricing wise, what sales are looking like for the first quarter, maybe two, to decide how much wine are we actually going to make this year. It's going to be tricky. And man, that was such a perfect segue, because the last question dives right into that kind of topic. Question number 4. Oh man. So I'm getting so good at this. Leading right into the next thing, like great transitions. I don't have to talk about it or explain it at all to fill the dead air that's happening. That's definitely not what I'm doing right now. All right, question number 4. After the 2024 grape market fallout, what are wineries doing now to prepare for the 2025 growing season? I'm going to pause for a quick minute, take a deep breath, because this is going to be a long-winded answer. And if you're watching on YouTube, you just watched me spill water all over my face. The joys of doing this kind of live and trying not to make a mess. Man, things were going so well. I definitely hyped myself up. I got greedy, y'all. I got greedy. Got a little too excited. All right. We're going to reset. We're going to start that over. 3, 2, 1. So, as we look forward to this 2025 growing season, I mentioned this in the past, but there is a Grape Crush report that all of us have to submit things to for this great state of California. And we have to tell them what varieties we purchased, how much we actually purchased in the form of tons, so every 2,000 pounds, right? How many thousands of pounds we purchased, the price that we paid for it, and the sugar level. But we don't really pay attention to the sugar level because that's kind of arbitrary based on when you decide to pick. Every producer is going to be different, right? But the big thing we're all waiting for is the number of tons harvested and the average price per ton, because it tells us exactly what everybody is paying. Now, it is anonymous. You don't see like what winery paid what, but you'll see like, oh, this person bought 12 tons at $6,000. This person bought 18 tons at $30,000. This person bought 5 tons at $60,000. And believe me, that's actually a thing. And it's crazy. So what that does is that we can look at that and kind of take an average and say, okay, based on the average purchaser, in this report, Napa Valley Cabernet is going for X amount of dollars per ton. To put it into a little bit of perspective, and this is from a few shows ago, likely earlier in last year, would have been the average price of Napa Cabernet. It crossed $9,000 per ton last year for the first time ever. And yet, as we got into the fall, right into the heart of the harvest season, you could easily, and I mean easily, find Napa Cabernet for like a couple grand, or picking costs, whatever the case was. You were able to get things at least 60% off if you weren't already tied up in a contract with an agreed upon price. So there were plenty of wineries still paying a lot of money despite the great deals that were out there. It just so happens that right now is kind of the negotiating time. You have some folks that have extended contracts with people that maybe have like 3, 5, or even longer terms to be sourcing from that vineyard at a certain agreed upon price, as well as volume in terms of the number of tons. But given where the market is right now, there's some stuff to be negotiated. And if you positioned yourself like us, we're not signing a damn thing until we see that Grape Crush report, and likely until we get through the first 2 quarters of this year, which is kind of a gutsy move because typically you want to have this stuff locked up and taken care of. That way, when harvest comes around, you're not scrambling trying to find fruit. But Right now, wineries might be willing to do that. The reason for that is what we've mentioned with kind of the slowdown of alcohol sales and in wine in general. If there is truly an oversupply and a glut, and and wineries have a lot of wine piling up in their warehouses that's not being sold, that means they're long on inventory. It's going to take them longer to get through that, which means theoretically, if the market continues to slow, they don't need to make as much wine this year or next year, if they make wine at all, maybe, depending on their size and scale and all that good stuff. It's an interesting time. So outside of the normal, just, hey, we got to prepare, the vineyards, give them a nice trim and a haircut with some pruning. We got to start, weeding and getting, frost preparations in place just in case we have a cold snap as they start growing. Outside of just the normal vineyard management stuff, the business and negotiation and contract stuff that's going to be happening this winter is going to be spicy. It's going to be super spicy. I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am, because I truly believe that the Napa grape market is inflated. You have a handful of folks that are selling their their grapes, and maybe their wines as a result, I guess. Maybe a little Freudian slip there, but all is true probably in both categories, that it's overinflated because the demand has been so high. And actually, going back to question number one, is it just what the market will bear? The answer was yes. And I mentioned that earlier, is that, hey, if you want our growers are saying, hey, if you want our Cabernet, this is the price. If you don't buy it at this price, we are going to have no problem selling it. And that has completely done a 180 over the last year. So right now, if I were a grower and I didn't have a lot of contracts locked in right now, I would be shaking in my boots. And even if I do, you know full well that there are going to be wineries looking for ways out of those contracts. It's going to be an interesting time to see what happens. Now, when this Grape Crush report comes out, this is going to be the really interesting thing, because allegedly there were thousands of tons of Cabernet readily available and plenty that didn't get picked last harvest. So what I'm very curious about is the difference between 2023 and 2024, and how much, in terms of tonnage, how many pounds of grapes were actually harvested, and compare those 2 years. If I had to guess, 2024 is going to be way less than you might expect. Although the prices, in terms of that average we mentioned, will probably be within a decent ballpark, except for the people that maybe drag it down a little bit because they could afford to buy some of that cheap fruit, or maybe they weren't locked into a contract and they just buy kind of as they go. That's certainly a thing. But it's going to be really interesting. What wineries are doing right now, man, we're preparing to kind of go to battle a little bit. At least I am. Because if we want to build long-term relationships with some of our growers again, and they want us signing on for multiple years, then guess what? You're going to have to give us a little bit of a deal. Or you're going to get stuck holding the bag because you're going to spend a lot of money farming that vineyard this year. And if no one is there to buy it for a second year in a row, ooh boy, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very, very interesting. And of course, these inflated grape prices, I think Napa is in need of a little bit of this correction, creates, more expensive wines for you all. This is why we've started sourcing from other regions like Clarksburg, where we can find slightly more affordable fruit. This is why, like, Brittany's wines that she started making are in like the $25 to $35 range, rather than the like $60 to $125 range, or even $80 to $125 range. There's something to be said for that. Now, whether or not this affects, Napa to that extent, you see grape prices and everything else, as we were talking about in the first question as well, everything kind of cascade down in a huge correction in the industry to actually reduce prices by a significant amount, yet to be seen. We'll see if it happens. But wineries are preparing to go into the season like, hey man, we've got a lot of wine stocked up right now. We don't need to be picking as much as we have in the past. And two, we're not paying top dollar this year. At least that's what I'm saying. And I think that's where a lot of folks that are sourcing need to start digging in their heels, because it has been unbridled, growth for a lot of the growers. And albeit, as we were talking about, labor, farming costs and expenses have gone up. So sure, have they gone up that much? Maybe, maybe not. I don't get to look at their books. But for the most part, over the last, 10, 15 years, growers have been able to say jump, and we just have to keep asking how high. So the wineries are in a unique position right now. And in fact, this was actually going to be happening in 2020, but it came later because, of course, we had the fires that interrupted that. This correction had already kind of started in 2020, going into the 2020 season. It just so happened that the fires reset it, because all of a sudden a lot of people weren't able to make a lot of wine, and you saw demand for grapes go through the roof in 2021 because everyone had to try and make up ground on a lost year. So it's been a really, really kind of crazy time in the grape market, the wine business side of things. It's all over the place. It's exciting, stressful at times, albeit, but can't win them all. So it's going to be interesting. If as far as wineries and how they're preparing, it's just going to be this make a longer answer longer. They're just reviewing their contracts. If they don't have contracts signed, they're probably just patiently waiting, because when the phone starts ringing from growers they've worked with in the past, they're going to field those calls. They're going to talk some shop, and they're going to say, hey, we're waiting for this grape crush report to come out. And that's typically in early February, I think. So we got a couple of weeks. We'll see that report, and we'll have a better idea of where everything's going to be heading, probably by the end of February. So we got about a month before things really start moving and shaking, and when we start seeing what is going to be available in the grape market as well. So we're kind of holding on to our butts right now, but we're prepared to kind of go to battle and be like, hey, you guys remember what happened last year? You guys got stuck, lost a lot of money on all this farming, and no one bought your grapes. We'll buy them. But guess what? Let's work together and not charge people an arm and a leg for things. We'll see if it actually pans out. Who knows? All right, that's all I got for this episode. Thank you all so much for submitting questions. Mike and Scott, big shout out to you guys in particular with the kind of back and forth over the last month talking some of these topics. Be sure to follow us as usual on YouTube, Instagram, the social network formerly known as Twitter, the Book of Face. Be sure to share, follow, subscribe to those wherever you're consuming your podcast. If you could do us a solid and leave us a little review, whether that's in star form or comment section, whatever that case may be, that helps with the algorithm and getting it out and about for folks. We will be back on February 5th. Oh my gosh, is that the next one? It's so close to my birthday. Hold on. I just totally brought up the wrong calendar. I can't read. Oh my gosh. Technical difficulties. What is going on here? Yeah, February 5th. We'll be back. I haven't decided on the topic just yet. We'll see. We'll see what we decide. We've got some good topics to kind of dive into that we didn't get to today. So maybe we try and stretch one of those from the wine business side of things into something kind of more interesting. We'll see where we go. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Appreciate you all. Have an excellent rest of your week. And we'll see you next time on the Wind Up Podcast. Cheers.